Hello, and thank you for having me. Thank you, Heather and the others, for organizing this event. Thank you to my family for joining me here tonight. I love Washington State and will take any chance to come back and visit, but this is sort of a sad occasion, to be honest. And I'm going to tell you about the story of what it was like to have my home raided by the FBI on September 24th. And then I'm going to talk about what the response to that has been, why we think it happened, and kind of where we're going from here. So Friday, September 24th, I awoke to the sound of a bang at my front door. Bang, bang, bang. And by the time I got downstairs, there were already something like 8 federal agents starting to organize themselves to go through every room of my house. My partner and my daughter were already awake. They were downstairs when the FBI arrived. The agents showed us a search warrant that said that they were looking for evidence of material support to foreign terrorist organizations. And we're going to talk more about what that means as the evening goes on. But they had a list of all kinds of things they could take from my home. They seized computers and my cell phone, my passport, checkbooks and financial records. They seized address books and sign-up lists. They seized, they would open up a file folder and look through every page of paper and pick out what they were interested in, anything about Palestine or Colombia or the Anti-War Committee or other organizations that I've worked with. And it took them 4 or 5 hours to go through our house, upstairs, downstairs, the attic, which is only squirrels territory, but, and the basement. And they took photographs, like our pictures. They took them from our home. They went through, I had, my grandfather died earlier this year, and I have all of his things. And they went through my grandpa's records of his life, and there was nothing that they didn't look at, and they carted away many boxes full of my personal belongings. And they were certainly most focused on and most interested in my activism, my politics, and who do I know. And anything about that they took, along with a few unrelated items too. When they came to the house, they said we weren't being detained. There were no charges against us, but they didn't want us to use the phone because they didn't want us to call people to come over and witness what was happening, or maybe organize a spontaneous protest against it, I don't know. But I insisted on the right to call my attorney, or an attorney friend, and he was actually in New Orleans at a conference for the National Lawyers Guild. He started getting the word out, and within about an hour, something like 20 people gathered on my front lawn. While this was happening, I was hearing my cell phone go off, and a couple of times I was able to see the caller ID, who it was. My friend Meredith was trying to call me, and my friend Mickey was trying to call me, and then they put my phone somewhere where I couldn't see it anymore, but because they wouldn't let me take phone calls when people would call me. And I started to realize that maybe it wasn't only my house that this was happening at. And when people started gathering on the lawn, they told me reports. In fact, my friend Tracy's house, this was happening. And you know, the media started showing up on the front lawn. It was 7 a.m. I didn't get to do my hair. And I had to start trying to respond to what was happening. The raid was still going on. And we learned from the media that, in fact, there were 6 search warrants being executed in Minneapolis, and we later figured out the 5 people and the offices of the Anti-War Committee were all being raided. And then still later we found out that raids were happening in Chicago as well. 2 different homes in Chicago were being raided. At the end of the search at my house, they handed both myself and my partner a subpoena to appear before a grand jury in Chicago. I'm going to say a little bit more about what I think of grand juries later, but they, all in all, gave subpoenas to 14 people between that day and the days following the raids. There were 70 agents involved in the coordinated actions that morning. And not only those homes that I talked about, they were also stopping by some people's houses to just deliver subpoenas. I had a friend in North Carolina whose door they knocked on, and they just wanted to interview him. They asked him to talk about his associations with me and others whose homes were being raided. They knocked on doors in California. They were making phone calls to people in Milwaukee, delivering subpoenas in Michigan. It was a major operation all unfolding at the same time. As I said, people gathered at my home and actually at all of our homes. There was dozens of people at every home to support us. In the week following the raids, there was more than 60 protests, and I know there was at least one here in Seattle. There's maybe been subsequent ones as well. And we've received more than 120 statements of solidarity supporting us. Many of these, as Heather mentioned, have been from unions. There have been people of faith. Actually, the state legislators in Minnesota, about a third of our state legislators signed a letter which they forwarded on to Obama and our federal congressional delegations, condemning the raids of our homes and condemning this grand jury process. We even received letters, like one of my favorite letters we received of support was from an indigenous community in Southern Colombia. The fact is that word got out what was happening, and there was just an immediate and resounding response rejecting this. And I think that's because of who we are. So I'm going to tell you more about who we are. Heather told you a lot about who I am. But all of us are anti-war activists. We do things like organize meetings like this one, educational events. We organize demonstrations. We call our politicians and organize call-in days to our senators and representatives. And as Heather mentioned, all of us actually were folks who helped to organize the anti-war march at the RNC in 2008. The anti-war movement is a big and broad movement. Probably most of you have participated in some anti-war events here in Seattle or elsewhere. Within it, those of us that are being targeted by this series of raids have in common a perspective of international solidarity. And what that means is that we believe that an important part of being against war is to give voice to the people who are under attack. And so we do things like travel to other countries. The Spanish class that Heather mentioned that I took was actually in El Salvador. And we were there because we wanted to understand what Salvadorans thought about US involvement in their country. I have traveled 10 years ago, I took a trip to Colombia where I was interested in learning about what Colombians thought about US military aid and what they thought about what were the prospects for peace and justice in their country. And we take these trips and we bring back pictures and stories and try to share the voices of the people, like I said, in the places where these wars are happening. And I think that's an important thing to have in the anti-war movement, and it's something that we've made a real priority. The other things about us, 10 of us out of the 14 are union members. Most of us are parents. A lot of us have young children. My daughter is 6, and she's the oldest of the little ones. But my friend Meredith has an 18-month-old daughter. My friend Thistle, who's from Oregon, has a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. And my friend Tom has a 5-year-old. My friend Hattem has a 5-year-old. And Joe and Stephanie have some teenagers, which they count too. But I'm just saying, most of us are parents. One of the people subpoenaed is a great-grandma, my friend Sarah. 2 of the people subpoenaed have spouses who are non-citizen immigrants. And in fact, in one of the raids, there were documents seized that were from the Immigrants' Rights Coalition in Minneapolis. And some of us are socialists, but all of us are people who are really deeply engaged in our communities and in trying to organize. And I think that was why the immediate outpouring in Minneapolis and Chicago was so substantial. But it really took off, right? And I think this night is a testament to that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. I want to say a few things about the particular sort of charge. It's not a legal charge. The particular suggestion that we are somehow providing material support to terrorists. That was printed in the local paper in Minneapolis, that my home was raided because I was funding terrorism, or I was suspected of funding terrorism. Imagine what that would mean to you if your coworkers and your neighbors read in the newspaper that you were helping to fund terrorism abroad. It was a smear campaign. I mean, it's not true. In my union, we've been on strike twice in the last 5 years. And the anti-war committee holds yard sales to pay our rent. We're not funding these movements abroad. We are interested in what people in other countries think about what our government is doing. But our role is not to fund them, to send them weapons. In general, we don't even send them T-shirts. You know, I brought you some T-shirts, but nonetheless, we've been charged with material support. And I think that Neil is going to talk later more about that law. But I'll say that what has become clear to me is that it's not only a question of sending money or weapons or T-shirts. It's a question of political support. It's a question of ideas and speech. And in fact, it has become apparent to me, like a bunch of law professors in Minneapolis have been published in the paper saying, well, it's maybe not against the law to meet with these people, but I wouldn't suggest it. You know, that the idea that it could be against the law for Americans to travel abroad and meet with people who our government doesn't support. I never imagined that that was illegal. I thought that we were free to travel. I thought we were free to associate with whoever we wanted. And I've always believed that we had a right and a responsibility to speak our opinions, and especially to speak and dissent when our government is making mistakes, to speak out against them. And I think that this law, like I said, thank you. I'm going to let Neil get into the nitty-gritty, but there's one last thing I want to say about the material support law, and it's sort of a historical thing. This is a law that was passed in 1996. It kind of got put on steroids after 9/11. But the work that Heather and I did with El Salvador, and certainly the people that did it before us, anyone involved in the Central America movement or the sanctuary movement, churches that gave sanctuary to refugees from Central America, if this law had been in effect in the 80s, would have been subject to prosecution, or certainly at least to suspicion and things like raids, like what happened to me. Similarly, the anti-apartheid movement. The ANC, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list until the day he was elected the president of South Africa. Imagine if the entire anti-apartheid movement was somehow under suspicion of terrorism and under suspicion of a crime that allowed federal agents to come into your homes and go through your things, seize your belongings, and accuse you of terrorism, or at least supporting terrorism. In fact, I was asked at a recent event, well, is there anything we can do to challenge who's on the list of terrorist organizations now? It might, in fact, even be a violation of the material support law to lobby our own government that groups like the ANC shouldn't be on it. That groups that may be freedom fighters when history looks at them, today the government may see them differently. And you and I, our right to even challenge how our government views organizations in other countries is restricted by this law. That said, I personally believe we should be well within our rights to give humanitarian aid, even in places where there's a political conflict, even in places where a government has taken one side in an internal conflict in another country. I personally believe it should be our right and our responsibility to become involved in these places, to travel, to learn, to hear firsthand from the people most affected by what our government is doing, what they believe should happen, what they think the course of the events should be, and what peace and justice could look like for them. And I also think that it's the First Amendment to the Constitution, the idea that we have not only a right but a responsibility to speak freely about our opinions about these conflicts in the world. I have recently learned that these rights that I thought I had are not protected, and so here I am. I want to tell you something that I refuse to tell the FBI, and I won't be telling the grand jury either, about my trip to Colombia. I went there 10 years ago, and I did two things in Colombia. First of all, can I just ask a request? Could you all promise not to tell the FBI if they visit you? Okay. But I've published on the internet and in newspapers my experiences. I'm not hiding them. I don't think they should be subject to some sort of criminal investigation. But I'm going to tell you about it. What did I do? Two things. I went in Bogota. They were having a conference. The social movement, labor unions, environmentalists, student groups, and others were gathering in Bogota to talk about Plan Colombia, which was the U.S. plan for military aid to Colombia. The activists in Colombia believed that it was going to have a huge impact on their ability to work for social change. And that's what they were meeting about, and I was invited to the conference, and I went and I listened to what they hoped for, what they wanted, and how they planned to respond. The other thing that I did, and this is probably the thing that the FBI would really love to talk to me about, is at that time, the Colombian government was in negotiations with the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the largest guerrilla movement or organization in Colombia. The negotiations were happening in a town in southern Colombia, and a part of the process were these public audiences, like a town hall meeting with different sectors of Colombian society. While I was there, youth from Colombia, from all over, they were coming in on buses from all over the country, were coming to talk about what young people in Colombia thought needed to be a part of the process for resolving the conflict in their country, what they thought peace needed to look like in Colombia. Things like the problems of access to education or employment or healthcare. And these audiences, these town hall meetings were broadcast on the national news, like their cable access station, right? It's the first time in Colombia that this kind of open dialogue has been accessible in the living rooms of Colombian people watching TV, you know? And what would happen is the comments from the public audiences would then be brought to the negotiation table, and the government and the FARC would discuss how they could agree, if at all, to address the demands of the population. I was as a peace activist, very interested in how Colombians saw peace happening, what they were talking about in terms of trying to make peace in their country. And so I traveled to southern Colombia. I watched the testimony of young people, and I also met the guerrillas who were involved in those talks. And I asked them what they thought the prospects were for peace in Colombia as well. I have to say, I believed that I was within my constitutionally protected rights, within my rights that are protected under international law. The New York Times was there. Diplomats from Europe were there. I thought that I had a right to be there too. That's being called into question. And at the end of the raid on my home, I was handed this subpoena to a grand jury. And they want me to come to the grand jury and to ask me questions about my travels, my political associates here and in Colombia. In the search warrant, they want to see every email I ever sent to somebody in another country, you know. And they want to know, then they do want to know if I've ever said anything or done anything to support people like the FARC, or the other organization they asked about in my subpoena was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Now, I believe that both of these organizations are legitimate and that they want justice in their countries. My government doesn't see them the same way, at least not at this point in history. Maybe someday they too will be sitting where Nelson Mandela sits now, but today they're not. I myself and all 14 of us who were subpoenaed initially have taken the stance that we do not want to testify before the grand jury. And there's 3 reasons. The first reason we don't want to testify before the grand jury is it is a very unfair legal process. And maybe Neil can tell you all about that later, but I was having a chat with my little brother about it, and he said, I thought the grand jury was, you know, grand with a gold-plated jury box and sparkling water instead of tap water, you know, and a really fancy judge. Grand. It's not. In fact, there's not even a judge in a grand jury. The whole thing is run by the prosecutor. He handpicks the jury, and there isn't another lawyer to object if he picks a biased jury, you know? And the whole thing is run in secret. So even though I'm willing to tell you guys all my business here, if I go to the grand jury, I can't tell anyone what I say there or what's asked of me. I don't get to have a lawyer with me. I have to go. I do not know if I'm a target of the grand jury or if I'm being asked to testify against my friends and associates. I don't even know that going in. And yet, I'm expected to go and participate in this very unfair process. I've been told by my lawyer friends that they have a joke amongst themselves that a prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. I'm hoping that being vegetarian will cut me a little slack there, but nonetheless, the point of that joke is that it's a very unfair jury, and that's the first reason we're not going to testify. It would be like asking for an indictment against ourselves or our friends. But the second reason is I really believe the material support law that they're investigating us under is very unfair. And I don't want to lend testimony against anyone else, certainly not myself, but also anyone else that I've done. I don't think that what we've been doing is wrong. And I don't want to help them convict others of violating an unjust law, an unconstitutional law. And, it's like saying, like in the Jim Crow days, asking me to come to a grand jury and say, did that black man drink from the white drinking fountain? I wouldn't go to the grand jury and testify about that either, because nobody should be convicted of a crime that shouldn't even have been named in law as a crime. The third reason we don't want to testify before the grand jury has to do with solidarity. Having traveled to Colombia, should I be asked who hosted me, shown pictures and say, did you meet this person in Colombia? The reality is that Colombia is a very dangerous place to be an organizer. As Heather said in introducing me, every day someone is assassinated or imprisoned who are trade unionists, like me. I'm in a union, people who are human rights organizers, mothers that disappeared. Every day they're treated like criminals, and the idea that my testimony could possibly lead to someone being killed in Colombia just because I remembered them and said that I had in fact met them, I couldn't live with that on my conscience. And just so you know, I'm not it's not like fantasy left-wing thinking here. This happened in the 1980s. The FBI investigated CISPAS, the organization that Heather and I worked with in the 90s. And in that investigation, they worked hand in hand with the Salvadoran National Police. And when they would take the records from CISPAS offices and get the lists of the members or the supporters of these committees around the country, they would then give them to immigration, who would deport any of the Salvadorans on the list, and they would give their names to the Salvadoran National Police. When those people were deported to El Salvador, many of them were killed or disappeared upon their return. So this has happened in our history, in our recent history. And none of us could live with that on our conscience. And so none of us are planning to testify before the grand jury. Our first step in that regard is we were called to appear for different dates in October. And through our attorneys, we communicated to the prosecutor that we'd be pleading the 5th. That's our right not to testify against ourselves. Since they hadn't told us who they were trying to make a case against, that was a good first answer. But now the prosecutor started to call people back. And I know that next week, 3 of my friends from Minneapolis will be notified of when they need to appear before the grand jury. There's a problem with the grand jury system. It's not only that it's not fancy, they can force you to testify or place you in jail. What they can do, and what we think is likely to happen to my 3 friends next week, is that the prosecutor can impose immunity and say, if you testify, we won't use anything that you say against you, in a prosecution against you. Now, we might still prosecute you with the words that those people say about you, but we won't use your words against you in a prosecution. Or maybe we won't, but either way, they give you this immunity that's, I think, a pretty slim guarantee anyway. And then if you refuse, if you still say, I'm not going to testify, even though you said I'm not going to be jailed for what I say, then they can hold you in contempt of court. And you can be imprisoned for months or years. And that's a very real possibility that my 3 friends are going to be facing next week, and that I may be facing later. And it's a very big deal for us to make this decision. As we mentioned, I'm a mom, and I can't imagine being taken away from my little daughter, who I love so much. But I also don't know what I would be teaching her if I chose to participate in this process that could end the lives of others. And it's a huge price to pay, but it's a worthwhile price to protect the lives of my friends and associates around the country and around the world, to maybe be separated from my daughter for some time. If the grand jury managed to get indictments against one or more of us and proceeded with the prosecution, I believe that the sentence for violating the material support law is something like 15 years. So the stakes are really high, and we're trying to get out of it. we're trying to stop the grand jury because we think that's the biggest. It sucked to have them going through my house, and I wish they'd give me my phone back and my passport. But really, the real danger to our organizing and our personal lives is the grand jury. And so we are working to build a movement that can help us stop the grand jury proceedings and stop FBI repression, because certainly they visited me on September 24th. They visited my friends the following week, and they might visit you later. And that shouldn't happen. And finally, a movement that can challenge this material support law, which has no protections for our civil liberties as I used to understand them. We're doing this through a couple ways. One is political pressure, and I'm gonna start passing around, or maybe Heather could help me pass around this clipboard. We're sending postcards to President Obama, asking him to intervene on our behalf. It's his Justice Department that's pursuing this case against us, and he can do that. So everybody sign a postcard before you go, please. We've had several national call-in days where people have called President Obama or Attorney General Eric Holder and asked them to intervene on our behalf. And finally, we've had a legislative campaign, and we're expecting that next week, my representative, Keith Ellison, who's from Minneapolis, will be coming out. Well, he is sending a letter to Eric Holder on our behalf. We're hoping that he'll be able to pull together a Dear Colleague letter, which in fact your senators and representatives could sign on to. It's like a thing that the Congress people do. They sign, one person writes a letter and then they all sign it, or hopefully a lot of them, and then they send it on. It has a little more weight than from one individual. We're trying to struggle with the legislators, all of our senators and representatives, in particular in Illinois and Minnesota. And as we get them signed on, we're going to be asking people out here in Washington and around the country to work to get your senators and representatives to back these same efforts. And finally, we're trying to just build a broad base of support. It's true, like I'm this, crazy anti-war activist that traveled to Colombia and met with these crazy people. But the risk that is posed by our rights being limited, the rights of the 14 of us being limited, it reaches out much further than us. And I know that some other activists or some of the other speakers are going to talk about that, but we really think that our best defense is to make it politically untenable for them to prosecute us, for them to pursue us. And that's by them knowing that you guys won't let them. And this is the very last thing I'm going to say, which is that I do think that there could be many reasons they might be carrying out this campaign against us, but certainly one thing that they hope for is to chill dissent, to make all of us more afraid to speak out and to come together and to organize around the issues that are important to us. But I like to say I'm now from Minnesota, and it is very cold in Minnesota. And we just put on some long johns and wrap on a scarf and go and keep doing what we're doing. The most important thing is that the anti-war movement and other movements not be stopped in our tracks by these kind of aggressions against us. And if they fail to silence us, and if they fail to silence you, then I think that is our best defense for all of us to not face similar actions in the future. So I want to thank you again for having me. I'm sure I talked longer than Heather said I would, but it's really great to be here at home in Washington State and talking with all of you. So thank you.
Okay, I'm supposed to do this in 12 minutes. Okay, it's going to be a challenge, but I'll try. My name is Amin Odeh, and I'm with Voices of Palestine. We're a local organization that started in the year 2000 when the second Intifada started in Palestine. I'm also with the Arab American Community Coalition here in Seattle. It's also a local organization that we founded after 9/11, a few days after 9/11. Just listening to Jess describe how the FBI came to her house and they knocked at the door reminded me of when the Israeli army came to arrest my brother, but they didn't knock at the door, they knocked the door down. And I just, while she's speaking, it's like living through that nightmare and hoping and praying that we don't get to that point here. that we cannot let them get away with this, because they're going down the same road, exactly like the Colombian government, the Egyptian government, and we just cannot let them do this. My first experience with talking about the relationship between our federal government and the Israeli government, and like sharing records, like you mentioned, with the the American, they're the same government, but the U.S. government and the National Salvadorian Police, it's different. Hearing about it is different than actually seeing it. And in 1990, when I was doing my paperwork to come here, at my final interview at the consulate in Jerusalem, the interview actually turned from an interview to almost an interrogation. And my shock, and this is where when you come face to face with this and see how much they share information, the official from the consulate who was doing the interview or conducting the interview had the same questions, or almost my answers from the interrogation session that I had at the Israeli interrogation room, or with the Shin Bet. I mean, I understand they get your you do a background check. They're supposed to know who's coming here, but but for them to know that much information, that information that was only mentioned in the interrogation room, it's very scary. So coming here to that, when they finally approved it with some serious, warnings. It wasn't intimidation or anything, but it was, just to let me know that they're watching me. When I arrived here in Seattle, I had another interview. It wasn't an interrogation session. It was just an interview, but it was the same thing, similar warnings. And that was in 1990. It wasn't after 9/11. It wasn't, a month ago after the 200 cartridges. This has been happening to many activists, and it's not new. So I wasn't surprised when I actually heard about these final raids. Unfortunately, it's happening under Obama, and this is something that I'm sure we can take this to another discussion. But it's the same federal government, and I know many of us are disappointed that Obama is allowing this. And in fact, this afternoon I was discussing this with my wife, talking about this meeting, and my 16-year-old daughter said, "Does Obama know?" I get this question when I go speak about Israel-Palestine at high schools and colleges, and many kids would ask me, "Well, does our government know about this?" When I talk about Israeli war crimes. Many people out there don't know, and this should be our job, to let people know that this is happening, not just to troublemakers. I mean, they try to make us look like we're all troublemakers. We're all, anti-government. We're just different, and it's to make it easier for people to accept this. So when I, living here in the 90s, it wasn't as bad, and like Jess mentioned, thank God there was no Patriot Act in the 80s or the 90s, because things changed after the Patriot Act, and I'm sure Neil can talk more about this. So when we activists who were living under military occupations, we always looked at you guys and said, that you're so lucky that you're living in the States. They won't shoot you. You won't go to jail forever because you're just raising a flag or, speaking out against an oppression or oppressed government. It's not anymore. I mean, this is changing, and it's sad to see this changing, and people are allowing this. So it's a big risk, though. It's very dangerous for all of us, and it's one of the reasons that I tell people that I do this. It's just I don't want my kids growing up here to be dealing with this, to live under a similar oppression or occupation that I lived under for most of my life. So this is one of the reasons what I do, knowing that they could detain me any day. It would be much easier for them. I mean, with my record, I could be deported. I could be sent to Guantanamo. I could be sent to a black jail in black prison in Eastern Europe. And this is, believe me, this is not a conspiracy. I'm sure many of you know this. They exist. So what Jess mentioned about the way these activists were, how their homes were raided. This has been happening on daily basis with the Arab and Muslim community. Thousands of people were detained and either deported or disappeared, or they were released with their lives ruined because you're a suspect. Your neighbor doesn't trust you anymore. You'll be fired from your job, and your life is over. So it's been happening to us since 9/11, and I will tell you about a couple of cases that we took. I mean, with the other organizations that I'm part of, the Arab American Community Coalition, like I said, we're a local group. We're all volunteers, and we decided to do this for the reasons I mentioned. We just refused to allow the government to do this to us, and many of our community members who were active before 9/11, unfortunately decided to stop because they were afraid that they're going to be detained or deported, or they'll be a target. Our argument with them was, you're a target regardless. Your background, your color, your skin color, your name, you're a suspect. After the Patriot Act, I mean, I think all of us, everybody who criticizes the government is a target. So we decided to continue, knowing that this could happen to any of us. But I agree with Jess, it's worth it for us to make it better for whether for us or for our children and grandchildren. We cannot let them get away with this. So we thank you. And we started a hotline. We answer the phone 24 hours. We're the first organization to start a hotline, and in 3 languages: English and Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. And it was interesting. After 9/11, we were afraid that it's going to be just the public reacting to this. So we had so much hate towards us, from mainly ignorant people. And it died down after the first few months. It changed. But what was interesting, that it picked up again from the government. It wasn't the public. I think the public it was a reaction to what they saw and dealt with, we understood why. It doesn't mean we accepted all this hate. But it was just, the scary part was how much the government did to us after that. And a couple of cases that I'm going to mention that we were involved in. One of them was here. One of them was in Florida, where a Palestinian American activist who was living here for 30 years, a legal resident, and he was active mainly on with the focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but he was also active in his own community, organizing, and they decided that he was financing Islamic Jihad and Hamas and other organizations. Came to his house, picked him up, and it was announced that even in Moscow by John Ashcroft that they got the head of Islam, the American Islamic Jihad. This is a professor living here in Florida for 30 years, doing everything in the open. But this is where it was after the Patriot Act. I mean, they did not have to prove anything. We're all suspects here until proven guilty. I mean, it's just very scary. After 4 years in jail, we helped raise some funds for him and his family. After he was ordered to released, they still kept him in jail. I mean, this is here in the States. A judge ordered him released. The Justice Department decided to keep him in for almost another year and a half. Then they released him, and he's under house arrest. He's still under house arrest. There was a hearing about a few days ago, and he's going to be forced to testify in front of a grand jury against people who he worked with in some nonprofit organizations. Many of them doing some work to support orphans and rebuild homes destroyed in Palestine. And it's not over yet for him. Another case for a Saudi gentleman who was here at the UW working at the School of Nursing. He applied for he was here for about, I think as a student, tried to change his status, applied for a change of status. His application was pending. He was legal. Well, what I didn't know with Majid is that his dad was also on a watch list by the Saudi government in the UK. The same week they picked up his dad because of something that he did or said. They picked up Majid, and in less than a month he was deported to Saudi Arabia. This guy was well known at the UW. He did everything in the open, but all what he did was activism, and most of it was criticizing the occupation, the Israeli occupation, the US occupation of Iraq, and the Saudi government. He was deported in less than a month without any, going through the legal system. So it is happening to all of us, to many of the Arabs and Muslims, and now it's happening to you. So I hope when you go home tonight, you think about this, that it's not just Arabs and Muslims who are going through this. If we don't act now, we're going to be all looked at and treated the same way. Thank you.
Hello, I guess I'm the designated historian here tonight. What I want to explain to you is that what you're hearing tonight is nothing new. This has been a part of the American political process ever since there has been. It is ironic, though they probably didn't know it, that I am also a wobbly for 40 years, member of the IWW and the FBI. Started off their little political anti-activism in part to crush the organization that I belong to, and I knew some of those old-timers that spent time in federal prisons, state prisons, for nothing more than taking out a union card. That's all they did. Matter of fact, in California, they got so tired of having trials of wobblies and sending them to prison, a judge came up and said, okay, I'm going to put out an order that if you're a member of the IWW, you're in contempt of court. And so all they would do is bring them into the courtroom, show that they were a member of the IWW, and off to San Quentin. With me personally, I got involved back in the late 60s and early 70s, and one of the things I got involved with was radical journalism. I was part of a newspaper that came out weekly, circulation of 10,000, called the San Diego Street Journal, and they decided that we were one of the targets that the FBI was focusing on back in those days. One of the reasons was that we got into muckraking, corrupt politicians and corporations and whatnot. We were responsible of getting Nixon's biggest campaign contributor busted and sent to prison. So they really disliked us. They shot at us. They bombed us. I was arrested 6 times in 1 year. They infiltrated us. And what they do, the thing that you got to understand about the FBI is that they don't always do things out in the front, like raid your home and put you in front of a grand jury. They'll go after your families. They'll go after your jobs. They'll go after any way that they feel that they can affect you, any way that they feel they can break you. And if you start feeling weak or showing signs of weakness or withdrawing from what you're doing, they'll go after you stronger until they can force you maybe to join their side and testify against other people. So you only have one choice if you're going to be an activist, and that is stay strong. Well, Us in San Diego, it was a continuous thing. We had to have 24-hour armed guards on our 3 houses, because the other thing that they did is that they infiltrated the militaristic right wing, an organization called the Minutemen. It's not the same organization you know today, but it was a right wing paramilitary organization back then which practiced terrorism on us, and we had to defend ourselves. Well, eventually, the FBI decided that the Minutemen were not radical enough for them. They weren't shooting and bombing us quite enough. So the FBI itself, its field agents, created an organization called the Secret Army Organization, which escalated the violence against activists. Not just the journalists like us, but the anti-war movement and everything else in San Diego. There's a professor down at Evergreen by the name of Peter Bomer who went through a lot of that I knew back in those days. After the Street Journal, once you get on their lists and get tagged by them, there's no retirement. You don't just ease away from the movement. They continue their persecution of you. With me, they went after my family, my kids. I have one murdered son because of them, and I went through a trial process that took me through the 70s. Well, one of the things that we discovered back in San Diego was that there were particular FBI agents that seemed to specialize in this. There was one particular FBI agent by the name of Richard Held. Now, this guy was involved in the suppression of the Panthers in San Diego. He was involved in the suppression of the Panthers in Los Angeles. He was involved in the murder and cover-up of Fred Hampton. Then later he came to San Diego, and he was the one that supervised and created the Secret Army Organization against us. He then, after that, went to Puerto Rico and practiced his trade there. And then after that, he went to Pine Ridge. And he was involved in the persecution of Leonard Peltier. Not only am I wobbly, but I've been working for Leonard Peltier continuously since 1979. I'm the Northwest Community Organizer for the Leonard Peltier Offense Defense Committee, which is out of South Dakota. And I have been organizing, many of you know me from the rallies that I've organized for Leonard continuously over the years here. We've had 63 rallies since 1992. The thing about Leonard's case, which is so important when you think in terms of the FBI and everything, is here was a person that got in the way of a governmental scheme, an illegal scheme, and that was uranium on the on the Pine Ridge Reservation. They discovered the uranium in the northwest corner, and then they had to find a way to get this land away from the Lakota people. The Lakota people up to that point had refused to take money for the Black Hills that had been stolen long before then, and they sure the hell weren't going to take money for more of their land to be stolen. They knew that. So they went about with a plan to suppress the traditional people of the Pine Ridge Reservation. This included death squads. This included whole villages that they would go in and shoot up. This included fraudulent tribal elections and everything where they put people in power that would do their bidding. Well, Leonard and some of the native activists of that time stood up to it. And unfortunately, there was a situation where the FBI came into their encampment in the same way that the drive-by shootings had been occurring on Pine Ridge in the last few years before that. Over 63 people had been murdered up to that point. They had real reason to fear for their lives. This was death squads like you heard about in El Salvador and other places, but in South Dakota. The same thing was happening. And in my opinion, the same people, the same mentality. Well, Leonard and these people stood up by it. These cars came up, there was a firefight, and 2 FBI agents died on that day, and one AIM warrior died on that day, Joe Stunts. Everybody got away for some reason, even though the FBI says that this was not something planned by them. They had over 200 agents there within an hour shooting at them. We also found out later that all the roads going into the area had been blocked before the shootout happened. All the local hospitals have been notified to expect casualties before the shootout happened. So we know that this was planned. And if anybody's responsible for the death of those agents, it's the FBI itself for sending them in like that. So Leonard went through a period of time where he was on the run and then was finally arrested. He was brought back to the United States when the United States government lied to the government of Canada and presented falsified evidence to them that they knew was false. He was tried and convicted after the original 2 members were found not guilty for reason of self-defense. His trial was moved to North Dakota illegally by means that nobody knows, to a judge that ruled everything against him, including self-defense, against the Leonard and his defense, and he was found guilty. Later on, through the Freedom of Information Act, we found that the ballistics report was fabricated by the FBI. We found that witnesses were intimidated. We got to the point where the government prosecutor came up and said, "We don't know who shot the agents on that day. Leonard was just there." We have disproved all the evidence against Leonard, but still, we ain't got to the point where the court has come out and stated that the government abused power, intimidated witnesses and everything. We still can't get a new trial. So we have coming up a new struggle of clemency for Leonard from President Obama as soon as it gets to his desk. There's a process there. Well, the last thing that I want to say to you all these cases that you've heard about tonight are important. When you hear about some case of suppression of an activist, it's important for you to come out and support those people, Leonard or anybody else. Not just because you feel for what those people come out have gone through, but because you're doing it for yourselves. You got to understand that everything that all these people have gone through, every one of you could at some point go through, because the government and the FBI does not care about principles of freedom. They care about only their political agenda and supporting the established quo, and if you speak out against that, you are a threat. And the only way to stand up to that, there's only one possible way, and that is when you come out in the public and build a movement against that. When you show that the people will not put up with it, they will stop, because they'll see that their actions is creating a solidarity movement in this country that there is no way that they can suppress. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Is this on? Okay. Yes. I'm Neil Fox from the National Lawyers Guild, and I want to start by saying to Jess next to me that my heart goes out to her, because there's nothing that I can say as a lawyer that can match the pain and mental anguish that she must be going through. And I'm honored to be sitting next to you, but my heart really goes out to you. Last week, I was riding my bicycle through downtown Seattle, and I went past the Sheraton Hotel at the corner of 6th and Pine, or Pike, and I saw 6 uniformed Nazis outside that hotel. These were 6 people. They had these blue uniforms with patches with swastikas on them. And they were actually there protesting against the Anti-Defamation League. So very bizarre. Because the first thing that I noticed were their signs. We're saying that, which is true, that the Anti-Defamation League has a blind spot towards Palestine. And I'm like looking at these signs, and I'm looking at the people that are holding them. And I realized that there are 6 Nazis who have the chutzpah to be in downtown Seattle. There are 2 older people about my age with no armbands, but they were kind of directing things. But there were Nazis downtown Seattle. And I just started screaming at them. I screamed at them in German, but they didn't understand German. But you know, that they would crawl out from underneath their rocks and come to our city. This is not Coeur d'Alene. This is not Hayden Lake. This is not Whidbey Island where Matthews had a shootout with the FBI 25 years ago. This is downtown Seattle, and that they felt that they had the safety and that they had the comfort level to come to our city and be out there with swastikas on their arms made me realize that we are in a very, very dark time. They were emboldened by the Tea Party, by those people that we think are laughable, really. But those people are a nascent fascist movement, and it is very, very scary. And in these dark times, our president's response is to move to the center. That's his response. He thinks that that's where he can keep his power. And what I think that these raids that have taken place in the Midwest mean, it really means that despite the fact that Obama was elected by the majority of the people in this country who wanted a change from the last few years of the Bush policies, that what it means is that when you get into power, even if you are the most progressive president, so-called, that we've had for many, many years, that the institutions control the people in power, that the institutions are there to promote a capitalist agenda, and that when you take power, even if you're progressive, that your destiny is set by those institutions. You may have the best of intentions, but those institutions are very powerful, and they will direct you. I had a friend who I used to work with at the Public Defenders who said that if Nelson Mandela was head of the King County Jail, it would still be the King County Jail. It's true, because those institutions drive what those people do. And so even when you have Obama in power, you have Eric Holder, they have no problems reaching back to the most repressive tools adopted by prior administrations. And the material support statute is one of those tools. They have no problems using those tools to advance what they think is their political agenda. And in fact, those tools are there and they're going to use them. We know they're going to use them. But the material support statute, and now I guess I have to be a lawyer and I have to talk about the law. The material support statute was adopted during the Clinton years. The earlier forms of it were adopted as part of the far-reaching Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This statute, passed by the Democrats, contained a series of very repressive tools. Apart from gutting the right of habeas corpus in federal courts, the material support statute was part of that as well. It was refined after 2001, and it has been the primary tool used originally by the Bush administration against the Arab American community, as we've heard. There was a charitable organization called the Holy Land Foundation that raised money for children and people affected by the Israeli occupation in Palestine. And that organization, people that were supporters of that organization, the administrators of that organization, people were prosecuted, the organization was shut down, and is really decimated. That was what was going on in this country in the early 2000s. This statute makes it a federal crime to knowingly provide material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization. Well, it sounds, well, foreign terrorist organization, material support. You imagine that what it means is that someone's sending guns off to terrorist groups, right? Well, wrong. First off, what's a foreign terrorist organization? How do we know what a foreign terrorist organization is? Well, the statute allows the Secretary of State to designate what foreign terrorist organizations are. This isn't something that's voted on This isn't something, I mean, it's on the internet. You could look it up on the U.S. Department of State website, and there's a list of them. But the list is very political in nature. Groups go in and out of this list over time to satisfy American foreign policy goals. Okay? And that's the reason why the Secretary of State has control over this, because this law is supposedly a foreign policy tool. But it's confusing. I mean, there are some groups on here that people would, Al-Qaeda would probably qualify. But then you have, for instance, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is a Marxist organization that has been within the PLO, sometimes actively and sometimes not actively, but been a core part of the PLO for years. Well, the PLO is recognized internationally as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and Fatah is the main party in the PLO, is in power in the West Bank. So by supporting the PLO, do you support the PFLP? I mean, how do you know? How do you know? The Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade is on the list. That's part of Fatah, which is in power in the West Bank. I mean, it's very vague. But once you get over the hurdle of figuring out what groups are terrorist organizations, then the question is, what's material support? What does that mean? Well, I'll just read from the statute. The term material support or resources means any property, tangible or intangible, or service, including currency or monetary instruments or financial securities, financial services, lodging, training, expert advice or assistance, safe houses, false documentation or identification, communications equipment, facilities, weapons, lethal substances, explosives, personnel, one or more individuals who may be or include oneself, and transportation, except medicine or religious materials. Well, okay, weapons, lethal substances, explosives, that sounds to me like material support. But what's training? Expert advice and assistance. What is that? Well, it probably includes legal assistance. There is a guy, an American citizen, who's on the list for assassination for support of Al-Qaeda activities, whose father wanted to hire lawyers to file a lawsuit in the United States courts to prevent his assassination. But the lawyers were afraid that they would be prosecuted for material support, for giving legal assistance to someone who's targeted for assassination. So they had to go and get an exemption from the government so that they could file this lawsuit. They got the exemption, but the mere fact they had to go seek an exemption is bizarre. Well, there has been a challenge to the statute for the last 10 years, constitutional challenge. And the Supreme Court in June of 2010 issued a decision in the case of Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, which upheld the statute against constitutional attack. The decision was written by Chief Justice Roberts, no surprise, Bush appointee, but Elena Kagan argued the case on behalf of the United States government. Okay? So Elena Kagan, who's now on the Supreme Court, the liberal appointee by Obama, she was the Solicitor General who argued that the statute was constitutional. So that should tell us something to make us very fearful about where the Supreme Court is going in coming years. But the case, if you read it, doesn't involve terrorists. It was a lawsuit by organizations that wanted to help groups on this list engage in peaceful activities. There was an organization that wanted to help the PKK, a Kurdish organization on this list, to help them advocate at the United Nations, to help teach how to resolve conflicts peacefully, to train members of the PKK on how to use humanitarian and international law to peacefully resolve disputes, to teach PKK members how to petition various representative bodies such as the United Nations for relief. That's what they wanted to do. They didn't want to train anyone on how to use guns. They wanted to teach people how to use international law bodies to achieve their goals rather than to fight. And this activity, the Supreme Court said, could be banned. That's the type of support, material support, that this statute covers, that it's intended to cover, and that constitutionally it can cover. And that's very scary. It's very scary because it makes this law so broad. I mean, you have to worry, about anything. Now, the Supreme Court said, no, don't worry about freedom of speech. People are still free to speak out about these things. And if you look at the very last line of the statute, it says that this law is not intended to affect any rights that are protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. I mean, nothing in this section shall be construed or applied so as to abridge the exercise of rights guaranteed under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Well, the Supreme Court upheld the statute. It is just very scary. This statute, if had been enforced 20 years ago, would have been used against those that supported, as someone said earlier, supported the African National Congress. It would have been used against NORAID, certainly, the Irish organization that raised funds for widows and orphans in Northern Ireland, which the U.S. always maintained and everyone thought was just a front for the IRA. The IRA that now basically Sinn Féin is in power in Northern Ireland, but this would have been used against supporters of NORAID. This would have been used against people that supported the rebels in El Salvador. It would have been used against those that supported the Sandinistas. This is a very, very far-ranging statute, and I'm scared. I'm scared about what's coming down the road. Grand juries, let me just take my remaining time and talk about grand juries. Grand juries were initially adopted to protect us. They were meant to be a buffer between the prosecutor and the charging decision. In Washington state, under state law, we don't have grand juries. The prosecutor just files by information. There's no grand jury system in the state of Washington. It's used in federal courts and it's used in other states. And again, it was intended to be a protection for us. If you look at the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment, it says that no one can be, held to answer except by grand jury indictment. This is a protection for us. But the system has been misused for years. And there have been a series of times in our history. I'm sorry? I'm sorry. I thought I had a loud voice, but maybe I got hoarse yelling last week. But there have been periods in our history where activists have been targeted by grand juries. In the 70s in this city, there were grand juries about the people connected to the George Jackson Brigade. In the animal rights and the environmental movements in the last 10 years, there have been a series of grand juries. If you're given a grand jury subpoena and you refuse to testify, and then you're given immunity and you still refuse to testify, you go to jail. People go to jail for the term of the grand jury. It's called contempt. And it is very real. People have gone to jail. I guess if anyone here is visited by the FBI and given a grand jury subpoena, the first thing you should do is call a lawyer. Okay? Don't talk to the police. Anything you say to the police or the FBI can be used against you. It can be turned and manipulated against you. Martha Stewart went to prison for lying to the FBI when they came to see her. Okay? The lying to the FBI is a very serious offense. And so, you might think, well, I could just talk my way out of this. I could just say something, argue with them about the First Amendment. No. Because anything you say is going to be turned and twisted and manipulated to make you look guilty. You may not end up with a charge of material support, but you may end up with an obstruction of justice charge for not telling the truth to the FBI. You have a right to remain silent. You don't have a right to tell them something that they think is wrong. Okay? You just don't talk to them. You say, I want to remain silent. I want to talk to a lawyer. Say nothing more. There's no such thing as off-the-record conversations. If someone shows up with a search warrant, they have guns, folks. They're going to come in. You're within your rights to ask to see the warrant, but do not attempt to argue with them. They're armed. They're trained to use force, so you don't argue with them when they come with a search warrant, okay? So I guess, I don't know, this isn't a very happy end to my talk. And I guess, you know, everything that everyone else has said about organizing and coming together in groups and showing that we care about what happens to people in different parts of the country, that we care about people outside of our own community, that we care about people from the Arab American community, that we care about people from the Somali community who have been subjected to this for the last 10 years. That's really, really important. So thank you very much.